Good afternoon, good morning, depending where you are. My name is Guy Berger. I'm a professor, retired, but I'm involved in a wonderful course on media and digital policy, which is online. It's free. You can pay a bit if you want to upgrade for a university certificate. It's brought to you, this course on media and digital policy in Africa, by the Namibian NMT Foundation and the Stellenbosch University Journalism School. This course takes you 4 weeks and it's about 2 to 3 hours a week. So I encourage you to consider signing up for the course if you're interested in these topics and you want to get more, I suppose, of a grounding in what the fundamental issues are. So welcome everybody. The link to the course will be in the chat and I'll give it a bit of a punt as we go through. We have 3 really excellent speakers. It's a privilege to have them and I'm going to introduce them just before they speak. So I wanted to, at the moment, just set the scene. Of course, it's no secret that many people have become very skeptical about big tech in recent times. And in fact, the big tech has not done much to counter the skepticism. Actually, big tech companies have been paying less and less attention to civil society and also walking away from the earlier support that they gave to media and journalists. I guess these tech giants have simply assessed that they don't need the kind of friendly allies to fend off regulation. They're now so big, they don't need the friends that they used to have in civil society and media. They want unfettered freedom, not for democracy or human rights, but to be able to collect data and make money at the lowest possible cost, including the cost of providing products that are safe and which cater to a range of African languages. In short, they want no regulatory friction at all. And we've even seen something worse because in recent years, we've seen a trend, instead of continuing some kind of de facto partnership with civil society, there's been pushback. For example, Meta and X have each launched court actions against researchers who have exposed hate speech on their platforms. We've seen some compromises with authoritarians, for example, allowing apps on app stores that track women in Saudi Arabia. And we've seen actions such as taking opposition politicians off Twitter in Turkey. In the past 6 months, we've seen big tech moving very close to the US government. The reason, of course, is to use state power, the US state power, to get their way with the rest of the world. And basically, what this has involved is primarily trying to get the US to push against EU regulation, which would give free rein to the US companies operating in the EU. There's even suggestions now that under this pressure, the EU could dilute some of its positions. So this kind of power push goes hand in hand, unfortunately, with the US government simultaneously working to weaken civil society around the world. Well, these major tech companies have moved with triumphant haste to drop their independent fact-checking in the US and in the EU, and to withdraw any controls on content that promotes hate against women and against LGBTI people. So in a nutshell, I'm going to wrap up now. There was once a kind of a partnership of big tech and civil society against regulation by authoritarians. And this has switched to the Western big tech making political concessions to authoritarians as part of a push that all governments should simply follow the industry's demands. That's not good for civil society or for media who are working for human rights, democratic accountability, gender equality, and the like. Very recently, we've seen a convergence with social media platforms and AI technologies, making for even more power in the hands of these conglomerates. The platforms have for a long time used AI for their advertising, for content feed rankings, and increasingly for content moderation. Now we see these platform companies using data to enter the generative AI business. That means they can control significant parts of both the production side and the distribution side of content. Who can compete and offer alternatives in this space, especially alternatives that could be focused on information as a public good? Now, I've painted a gloomy picture, but in the African context, we have seen some different responses coming back, which in a way we hope can push back against tech power. That's the theme of this webinar. The big question that we need to keep in mind is, to what extent could some of these responses in Africa, which we're going to hear about now, to what extent could they turn into something problematic, like giving a bit of power to authoritarian governments to bend the big tech a little to accommodate their interests? Or could some of these developments in Africa help to rebalance a triangle where you have civil society and journalism back in the relationship, and you have tech and you have governments, so that the three power centers could then return to a kind of a relationship where each was keeping each other in mutual check? So this is exactly what we're going to interrogate. Are we looking at a situation where there's less and less power for civil society and media, or are we looking at a rebalancing that could take place in this space? So that's the introduction, dear people. Now we're going to get into our experts. So let me get to my program here and say our first speaker is going to be our African rapporteur. We can have a slide, please, dear Tatenda or Chris. The African rapporteur, that's Ovina Grisha Topsi-Sono. She has been a commissioner in the African Commission of Human People's Rights. She was appointed in 2021. She was renewed in 2024. She's a legal expert based in Mauritius. Her career has been advising ministries, drafting laws, and now she's parliamentary councillor in the Attorney General's office in Mauritius. So, Commissioner, we're so pleased that you're here to tell us a bit about the three rights you're working on, and tell us how these can be relevant to the combined African momentum for platform accountability and digital rights, and why people should be involved. So we'll put the focus on you, and then I'll start showing the slides the moment you want me to do that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Guy. Thank you for the introduction. Indeed, the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression and Access to Information with the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. So since last year and beginning of this year, we've had 3 resolutions on digital rights, namely the one on access to data, the one on information integrity, and the one on public service information. So we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and within the African Commission itself, we have special rapporteurs. We have one on special rapporteurs on prisons, one on women's rights, and I am special rapporteur for freedom of expression and access to information. Next slide, Kai. So what we have as at present as soft law instrument with the African Commission, and especially the Special Rapporteur, is the model law on access to information in Africa, and that was developed in 2013. We also have a guidelines on access to information and elections in Africa, which dates back to 2017. We also have a Declaration of Principles on Freedom of Expression and Access to Information in Africa, which was developed in 2019. Now, we thought, because in this new era, digital rights has taken the forefront, we thought that probably digital rights instruments have to be brought into the 2019 declaration. And therefore, we have passed Resolution 620 on access to data, Resolution 630 on information integrity for platforms, and Resolution 631 on public service content. So the African Commission on Human and People's Rights has tasked me to develop guidelines on these three digital rights instruments, that is on access to data, information integrity, and public service content. And to that purpose, we are working with certain NGOs to develop these guidelines, and the time frame has not been set by the African Commission, but we are hoping that in the near future we will be coming up with this. So let's go to the extracts from Resolution 620. We are saying that access to data is therefore an extension of the right of access to information, and there has been concern at data exploitation practices, mainly by the private sector, particularly big tech entities. And the guidelines are there so that data held by public institutions and bodies receiving public funds, as well as those held by private actors, where there is an overriding public interest in access to data. And these should be made publicly available by default. Next slide, Guy. We also have Resolution 630. So in that resolution, there has been deep concern at the request by technology companies with regard to information integrity and online protection. And we have noted the weaponization of a particular social network without mentioning names and its related AI services, which has been a departure from the fact that a platform should be neutral. And these guidelines, I have been tasked with developing guidelines which will assist states to monitor technology companies in respect of their duty to maintain information integrity throughout independent fact checking. Next slide, Clive. Thank you. So Resolution 631 recognizes that universal access to quality public interest content is a central pillar for actualizing the right of access to information. Online services are not currently regulated to meet public interest benchmarks, such as information and factual news, education programs, youth services, local content and languages, and impartiality on elections coverage. These guidelines can helpfully bring forward a future-focused policy framework for universal access to public service content by ensuring a public interest element for all platforms in Africa. So what we have is that why should we have these guidelines and why are these three resolutions important? So if the guidelines are taken up by African states, our individual countries would be stronger together. It can make the platforms more accountable, but also accountability needs to bring forward the performance of human rights in Africa. And we do not want accountability which is undemocratic political pressures. And we think that Africans can make it happen. So we have Resolution 620, where I am being helped by African Alliance on Access to Data, Resolution 630 on Media Monitoring Africa and UNESCO, and Resolution 631, SOS Support Public Broadcasting Coalition. But we've had in the past week other NGOs who have shown an interest in helping us with one particular resolution. So I urge you to take part in the consultations. You can check the websites of the supporting organizations and complete the online questionnaires. You can volunteer for the drafting of the guidelines. And the African Commission will hopefully consider these in November this year, as for a resolution 6:20, and for 6:30 and 6:31 early next year. And we urge states that once we have these tools, they will be able to be implemented in law and regulation and take practical steps to ensure that all our digital rights are usefully protected in Africa. Thank you, Guy.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Thank you for your leadership on these issues, and I hope people can get involved, and we may have some more questions for you as we continue here.
Sure,
So,
I'll be there.
Okay, wonderful. This is Murray Hunter. We asked him to speak about one of the initiatives in an African country, namely South Africa. And I hope he's going to be able to cover the Competition Commission here, which has held an inquiry about big tech, and the business going on at the information regulator. Murray Hunter has been an activist in South Africa for more than a decade in the Right to Know coalition. He's been a journalist working with the Amabungani Investigative Journalism Unit. He has done a children's book on surveillance capitalism. And right now he is senior associate and head of special projects at a public law firm called Alt Advisory. Murray, over to you.
Thank you very much, Guy. I should just quickly say, in case anyone comes to me for legal advice, that many of the people working at Alt are lawyers, but I am not one of them. So we're not actually a law firm, but we do, through our partner law firm, occasionally get involved in these things. Yeah, thank you very much for having me join this conversation. I think it's a really timely one. I was going to give an overview per your request about what's happened within the Competitions Commission in South Africa. I see from a number of the guests have been people who are right at the coalface of that issue, so we may have some contributions from the floor on this one as well. But for those who haven't, I think maybe just as background, for those who hadn't followed it, what's been quite a long and technical process, the South Africa's Competition Commission is sort of as part of a broader global trend of competition authorities looking at these big dominant tech platforms and trying to figure out, really reach a decision on what the impact of their dominance has been on the news media ecosystem. These are not news media organizations, but they are often a mediator for people getting their news, and also they're often a mediator for the revenues that goes to those news organizations, because they are either directly in competition. Facebook, as an example, is a big digital advertiser, almost as an opposition to traditional news houses. And then something like Google, for example, is actually an advertising broker. And so it's kind of the mediator of revenue that a news organization is increasingly relying on for its survival. So there've been a number of these processes. I think probably, if not the first, the most prolific was in Australia, 2019. There was one that I think reached its conclusion in Canada in 2024. And South Africa is the first, as far as I know, that's sort of unfolded in the global south. And it, in fact, is still ongoing. It reached a decision, what's called provisional finding, in January, or perhaps in February. But that's being contested by some of the parties, and there will be a final outcome, we think, by the end of this year. So for those who sort of want the AI summary, or at least the kind of cliff notes, essentially the commission heard from a number of the platforms, not just Google. Obviously, Google has probably been the most sort of, many people think of this as a Google decision, but I think Microsoft was in there, Meta was in there, a number of other social platforms were in there. It heard from the platforms, it heard from news publishers, it heard from analysts, from many of the people in this room, sort of firstly making the case either for or against the fact that these platforms are by dint of their extraordinary size and kind of span of the digital sector, and then the fact that they're playing, in some cases, like for example, Google are playing multiple roles. They are an arbiter of traffic for news organizations because of their search function and because of their news function. And then they're an arbiter on revenue because they have a ad buying and selling business, and are often something that news organizations either need to rely on or try to work in opposition to. And so the extent to which this dominance is affecting news revenue and is somehow has a causal effect to the sustainability crisis in journalism. Then secondly, if that is the case, measuring that impact and trying to kind of quantify it. And then thirdly, recommendations about if we reach a kind of a conclusion on questions 1 and 2, what should be done about this? And in January, after I think about a 2-year process, the commission came up with its interim findings, effectively finding, in particular, that Google, through its sort of its dominance and its kind of its market dominance, had abused its position and had sort of actively starved news organizations of revenue, in part because of those sort of being able to play these multiple roles. And there was an estimation that the commission arrived at that somewhere between 300 and 500 million rands in lost revenue had occurred, essentially where, in part because Google has the ability, by providing a summary or snippet of news, of preventing people from clicking through and going through to the actual news organization, where it would be counted as essentially a kind of almost like an ad metric on the news publisher platform. So it found that its recommendation is that Google should pay something between 300 and 500 million rand over the next 5 years towards the news publishers. It's recommended the possibility of a digital tariff, essentially an ad tax, for platforms, Google-like platforms, to pay towards news publishers. The possibility of paying a tariff for data that the search platform would access, is essentially like content that it would scrape in order to train an AI platform, for example, and a number of other things. And so it's kind of, it's asking for some very significant structural changes and measures to be put in place by these platforms in order to address this. I will say that the platforms have come back with some quite significant opposition to this. And so we'll have to see how much of this changes or is amended slightly in whatever final finding the commission has found. I think it's worth reflecting on a few of the sort of the lessons that are being just discussed within civil society, and just from observing this, like what came out of this process, because this was the first. I think it's significant. This is the first finding of a competition authority that's not in the global north. And what we've seen is that this is kind of like these kinds of findings are contagious. A competition process starts in one country, another competition authority somewhere else is watching and learning. And in some cases, I mean, they've been very clear that they're actually discussing amongst themselves across borders about learning from each other, and in some cases working in concert. So we presume that this is not the last process that we're going to see. And I think that is, that is very encouraging and really has prospects of shifting the balance of power slightly. But one of the things that is worth also noting is that my perception is that the news publishers have acted in a relatively well-organized, engaged way. That there was not one of the things that has allowed, for example, a Google to operate in this way is that every publisher is fighting for their own survival and interacting with the big tech platforms individually. But in this case, for example, you had publishers working in consortium with one another, cooperating, sharing resources, sharing the information and insights. And that has been, I think, very important towards guiding the commission on, identifying one narrative. And not having to sort through 100 different submissions, making slightly different claims that potentially contradictory. And so they've pooled limited resources in order to move this process along. The other thing is that the commission itself was I wouldn't say it was biased, but was relatively sympathetic towards understanding the roots of these issues and not allowing companies and actors that have extraordinary legal resources to dominate the process. A competition process is very technical, it's very legal, it involves, it's a very specific mechanism. And I think that the commission has worked very hard on making it an accessible platform and hearing all sides and sort of not allowing anyone to get shut out. And so in situations where the authorities are maybe a bit more operate on a bit more of a closed door basis or don't pay as much attention towards their public mandate, that could be more challenging. One of the risks that has been named in the commission process or in the inquiry process is that there is the risk of unintended consequences, essentially by creating potential financial penalties for platforms to continue their kind of behavior, potentially quite cannibalistic behavior towards news media. Platforms do have one option, which is to simply say, fine, we're not going to engage in news media anymore. And this is something that's happened in Canada. Canadian users of Facebook or Meta platforms are supposedly no longer getting news through, no longer accessing news through those platforms because Meta essentially said, fine, we're not going to play. And we're still trying to understand what the long-term impacts of that are on the news ecosystem. Firstly, for ordinary people who are news consumers, and then secondly for the publishers themselves. And so there is a slight risk that you cut this wire and something happens that is less desirable.
Mary, perhaps I can just pause you there. Okay, make your final.
No. I think that's fine. I realized that I was supposed to be talking about two cases.
Right.
Good to hand over.
Just before we move on, I wanted to say that this competition commission story is obviously potentially going to hit tech at the economic level. In South Africa, there is also an ongoing situation with the information regulator, where various groups wanted information from big tech about how they were going to deal with the elections. In that case, it wouldn't have cost big tech money to actually provide the information, but they didn't cooperate, and they said that the South African information regulator does not have jurisdiction over them. So they continue to do business here, but they claim that they don't need jurisdiction. They don't need to abide by the country. So that is where that is. So if they were playing this hardball when there was no cost involved, I'm not sure what will happen with the Competition Commission, where they may have to pay real money. But as you said, there is this risk of having an impact that could be a kind of a boomerang, and that's exactly what Meta have been playing with in Nigeria. We're going to hear about that right now. But before I introduce our next speaker, I wanted to give you a commercial. This webinar is brought to you by the online program in Media and Digital Policy, and that's coming to you from the NMT Trust Foundation, the Namibian Media Trust Foundation, and University of Stellenbosch. And I'll ask my colleague Chris to post the link in the chat. You can take this course. It's 4 weeks and it's 2 to 3 hours a week. It's free. So I'd encourage you to consider signing up if you want to get more underlying concepts about law and regulation and governance of digital and media in Africa. So, ladies and gentlemen, you're now going to have the pleasure of hearing the founder and executive director of Tech Societal Digital, which is a social enterprise in Nigeria, deals a lot with digital policy, gender equality, digital rights. Tope herself was previously the chief operating officer and the program director at Paradigm International, covering 8 countries. She's an alumna of several universities, and she has recently organized what was called a huddle, Huddle, a huddle, about what's been happening in Nigeria as regards rulings about big tech. And she could update us on that and say what the prospects are for how it's going to evolve, and whether indeed it could lead to companies like Meta deciding to withdraw from Nigeria altogether. Over to you, Tope.
Thank you so much, Guy. Hello, everyone. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to give you a brief background into the legal and policy context of what's been happening in Nigeria, helping you to understand the issues around investigation of Meta for potential violations of certain acts in Nigeria. And I can see colleagues on the call. Some of them may be familiar with this case already and may be able to fill in if there are gaps, but let me just give you a quick background to the issue. So these investigations began in 2021 and spanned 38 months, I think from May 2021 to December 2023. Meta in Nigeria was being investigated for potential violation of what is called the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Act, the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation, and then I think those two laws basically. There was a joint investigation by the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection Commission and the Nigerian Data Protection Commission between 2021 and 2023, like I have said. And at the end of that investigation, a summary of $290 million fine was jointly issued by the Federal Competition and Consumer Protection, the Nigeria Data Protection Commission, and the Advertising Regulatory Council of Nigeria, called ACON, jointly issued a fine of about $290 million. $220 million was from the FCCPC, $37.5 million from ACON, that's the Advertising Regulatory Council, and another $32.8 million from the I'm talking in terms of $1 million now, from the National Data Protection Commission. So in 2021, WhatsApp privacy policy update took effect in Nigeria, and that's when the investigations started, with the FCCPC issuing order to Meta to show cause. Meta responded, and there was this back and forth that was going on, investigations, Meta contending the findings of the FCCPC. There were a series of conversations that went on around presenting evidence and reiterating the intent of those policies, those 2021 policies. FCCPC at some point conducted an independent market study. At some point requested the data storage location information from Meta. This went on, like I said, for about 2 years. At the end of the 2 years, the final ruling was that Meta, in terms of violations, Meta had was violating the law in terms of unauthorized data use without consent, discriminatory practices against Nigerian users. They were accused of abuse of dominant market position, cross-border data transfer without authorization, and also imposing exploitative privacy terms. And then the fine was issued in June of the following year. So in terms of the legal basis of the regulatory action, FCCPC, theirs was in terms of abuse of market dominance and consumer protection violations, and the fine was $220 million. it was the Data Protection Commission that ruled around unauthorized data sharing and breaches of the Nigeria Data Protection Regulation and fined 32.8 million. And then the Advertising Council came in and said that ads were being published that would have required prior approval under the advertising law, and also issued some fines to Meta. So along the fines, there were some mandated corrective actions. One was to ensure the right to data self-determination. Another was to stop unauthorized data transfers. That is, Meta had to now obtain prior approval before transferring any personal data out of Nigeria. They had to eliminate discriminatory practices. They had to comply with Nigeria's data protection laws. And they also had to implement some changes to Meta products in partnership with, state-sanctioned institutions, that warn users about manipulative data practices and, pose other arms to them in terms of their use of these products. So Meta's position to all this is that, while they have not announced full exits, they did state in court papers that there would be a shutdown or withdrawal of Facebook and Instagram, that this is a possibility. And they labeled some of the requirements as unrealistic. For instance, that some of the product changes required were unrealistic. They argued in court that the Nigerian authorities were misinterpreting some of the existing laws. And then in terms of perception, so when that's the summary of the situation leading up until this point. There was also like an appeal to the tribunal at the FCCPC, and the tribunal upheld the ruling and that the fine has to be paid before in 30 days. That's by June 29, 2025. So that's the situation in Nigeria, and that's what we're dealing with right now. In terms of perceptions, what we're hearing, what we're feeling from stakeholders is, first of all, there's serious concern over Meta's threat to remove Facebook and WhatsApp in Nigeria, because WhatsApp was ironically the focus of the regulatory probe, but instead, it's Facebook and Instagram that Meta is threatening to withdraw, and that those were not included in the investigation. So that's raising questions about the strategy of the company. There's also kind of like a growing trust deficit around transparency of the fine that has been imposed. People are noting that while there's been a fine imposed on Meta, there's been domestic agencies and actors that have been repeatedly implicated in data protection violations, but they've not been held to the same standards. So that perceived inconsistency is also raising concern about like selective enforcement of the law and the true commitment to upholding digital rights across Africa. That said, there's a strong, from all stakeholders, there's a strong expression, there's a strong support for digital sovereignty and user protection. People are seeing this as a pivotal moment to ascertain Nigeria's digital sovereignty all the same, while advocating for, fair regulation that holds big tech accountable. And there's also optimism around this moment, for not just focusing on Meta, but, attention paid to broader platform issues in Nigeria as well, and just big tech generally being held to account around user exploitation and the need for equitable digital protection and participation. Again, the concerns we're hearing are also about regulatory fragmentation. So when there are multiple regulatory bodies, there's the FCCPC, as I'd mentioned, that's the Consumer Protection Commission, there's the Data Protection Commission, and then there's ACON, the Advertising Council of Nigeria, and all of these are conducting, to one degree or other, separate investigations, imposing separate fines. So that, is perceived as a lack of like coordinated strategy, and that could also contribute to like undermining the moment and the credibility of the enforcement efforts. What's at stake? First of all, of course, digital access and expression, the risk of loss of platforms for free expression, for activism, for community. There is the economic impact that is going to be huge, assuming that this really goes through. There was a study that we came across in 2023 that seemed to suggest that about 96% of medium to small scale enterprises in Nigeria led by women and youth are on these platforms. Creators right now are highly vulnerable. Currently, there's no local alternatives. If there were, there's even limited time to pivot. So yeah, and that's what we're seeing that is at stake. And more broadly, the precedent that all of this sets, that the tone for how big tech for how Africa engages big tech. Is this a bold move or is this overreach? In all of this regulatory tension, we think it's important to center users and talk about proportional remedies and transparent processes and open the channels for dialogue. And more importantly, also align with human rights standards. In terms of the broader implications for digital governance, I already mentioned that the local infrastructure is weak or maybe completely absent. There's heavy platform reliance, so fragility is really high. It's really important that we maintain a rights respecting environment in the midst of this enforcement and avoid the risk of collateral harm to vulnerable users. And in terms of prospects for compliance, so what we're saying is that the Nigerian authorities have described Meta's withdrawal threats as pressure tactic, and they're urging Meta to comply regardless. Meta has plans, we think, to appeal to higher courts and possibly seek a stay on the tribunal order. Will Meta pay? FCCPC's firm FCCP stance, the Consumer Protection Commission, their stance is firm until now. They're supported by the NDPC, and this is sending like a really strong signal in terms of unified oversight. There's insistence on compliance. We could talk about if the revenue share that Nigeria brings, and if the fine is proportionate or not. But we're seeing that the authorities are insisting. There is political pressure to think about. There is the public outcry that we've seen from the time that announcement was made until now. With all the local users, if the service is shut down, there could be public pressure around that. There's also conversations around global behavior of Meta. Meta is paying fines in other regions, in the EU, in the US, without threatening exit. So why is Nigeria unusual? And regulators are saying that we don't want to be unique in this way, and we don't want Africa to be a distant outpost. And we need you to comply. So we are expecting that Meta will appeal. We don't think that, in terms of what is most likely, we don't know, but we're not, there's no way to be sure, but we don't think that the exit will happen by June 29. We think that this would harm Meta's long-term regional strategy. We don't think they'll go in that direction. We know that Meta is under pressure. We know that they may continue to litigate further. We know that they may negotiate. And we also know that the regulators are not backing down and have shown some level of unity and resolve. So yeah, that's the summary of the cases I can give you currently. And the question that we've been asking to ourselves and to stakeholders is, how do we, going forward, ensure that we're balancing enforcement with digital rights and inclusion? And how do we continue to push for accountability from platforms and our regulators? So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. People, once again, I just want to make a commercial announcement. If you have just joined us, this is a webinar in a series that is brought to you by Namibian NMT Trust and University of Stellenbosch for this free online course on digital and media regulation. So I again ask my colleagues to pop the link in the chat. Please consider picking up on it. It's not going to cost you anything, but it'll give you a lot. I wanted to just sum up some of these things and then ask our panelists to give a final thought. So the Nigerian case is very interesting because it started with data, as you said, accusations of misuse of data. And what happened there is that the company then used its other properties as leverage to say why it shouldn't be brought to book for violating people's privacy rights. So the case started with WhatsApp, and then it was Meta saying, well, if you hammer us here, we will deprive you of Facebook and Instagram. So that's very interesting. And one would only wonder what would happen with AI as well, whether, it would be, AI would also become something that would be used for leverage. The South African case is partially about intellectual property, whether the big tech owe the media for using their content unfairly. It's partially about the domination of the advertising industry in the advertising chain, and it's partially about the right to compete. And then also South Africa was about the access to information and access to data in the information regulator space. So I'll just add to those two case studies that there's Kenya, which is about labor rights. There have been very interesting decisions in Kenya to hold big tech account for the treatment of people at the bottom of the tech stack who are labeling data or doing reinforcement learning for AI. So these three things I've mentioned, the data, the IP, advertising, right to compete, information, data, access to information, and then the question of Kenya labor rights, none of them are about content as such, which is interesting, but they all have implications for content. And when we come to the rapporteur's presentations, and maybe I could show the slide again, but you've got three resolutions there. And these resolutions are about, if I can just come back here, right. The first resolution is about access to data, 620. So again, it's not content directly. The second resolution is about monitoring information integrity. So it's not saying that platforms, should take down people's speech. It's saying, are you doing fact checking? We want to see how much you are taking care of hate speech on your platform and so on. And then the third one on public service content, this is interesting because this one is also not about trying to take content off the internet. It's trying to elevate public service content and African languages. So we've got a very interesting package here of a lot of issues, from the economic to the data, to the right to compete, to the labor rights, through to access to information, through to these three resolutions. And I think this really shows us just how complex the whole situation is about trying to, in the global power game, trying to bring big tech to account. And as was said in the rapporteur's presentation, not account to authoritarian or anti-human rights causes, but to civil society and digital rights and media. So with that, I know we don't have much time left, but I want to ask our three speakers if they will take the floor. And perhaps we could start with you, Commissioner Topsi-Sono. If you have any thoughts or takeaways, just 2 minutes on having heard this whole thing, how you see the work you're doing in relation to that big picture. Over to you. Well, let's see. While we're waiting, let's move to Murray then, and then we'll come to Tope.
Well, since I've got 2 minutes to solve this is a very thorny issue. I think part of it, I have to believe that part of it becomes simpler once you seriously talk about unbundling these enormous entities into just very large entities, right? And unfortunately, some of that is out of our control. Those things happen in other countries and jurisdictions that have shown very little interest in this. But for example, if all of these different actors that make up Google are actually different companies that are not solely dealing with one another, but dealing with other actors, it becomes a lot easier to get fairer and more accountable behavior from them. Now, just because that isn't the power to do that is out of our hands here in the global South, in South Africa or elsewhere in Africa, does not mean that we shouldn't continue to push for this. I think the level of cooperation and collegial interactions that you've seen with authorities across the world, with civil society bodies across the world, except in the US, is very encouraging and needs to be pushed to its sort of maximum conclusion. Because sort of as soon as we start acting a bit more in concert, it becomes a lot harder for these actors, or it becomes at least a little bit harder for these actors to deal with us each as kind of ants under the feet.
Okay,
I'll
thank
leave it
you.
there.
Thank you. Let's have Tope, and I see the rapporteur's online, so we'll give her the last word. Tope, you go first.
Yeah, so in terms of the question you asked about why Facebook and Instagram as a leverage and not WhatsApp, and the concerns there about even use of AI as strategic leverage in future, I think that the platform is using those, the Meta may be threatening withdrawal of the more visible platforms, the most social and often political platforms that are widely used. Just because of the potential for public political pressure, public perception. I think it's also a strategic distraction in some way, because a lot of people did not even know that the original issue, the data handling issue on WhatsApp, what was the original issue. And I think that in terms of what the main thing is how this may be framed now and in the future, in terms of like the innovation versus regulation binary. There could be claims, for instance, in the future that we can't offer certain tools, certain cutting-edge safety features, because of regulation and all of that. And I think that it could, using this as a bargaining chip is a no-no. I think that we should push back against that innovation versus regulation binary. I think it should be clear that avoiding basic accountability is not fight for free speech. I think that, it should be emphasized that data rights, fair treatment, content moderation are about trust and safety and democratic integrity. In terms of the data access that the rapporteur was talking about, I think that's really important. If we want transparent laws, we need to ensure that we have access to. If we want, I'm looking for the right word, but if we want regulation that works, we need access to data. In terms of like the platforms being subject to audits, to impact assessments, to disclosure requirements. For regulation to work, we actually absolutely need access to data. And yeah, I think that we should start defining more clearly performance-based expectations, and we should resist the pressure,
Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic. 100%, 200%. Let's, just because of time, ask the rapporteur if she'll come online. And then I'll also ask Chris Cabota to put the email into the chat if anybody wants to get access to the recording, or if you want to find out more about the course. So Chris, if you could put that in. Rapporteur, excellent. Commissioner, over to you.
Yes, thank you again, Guy. Guy, I was just saying that I think it's a great time for all of you to get together to help us with these guidelines that we are developing for Resolution 620, 630, and 631. Please, I think it's high time that the tech companies be responsible, and if every country goes on its own to the tech company, it's not going to work. As a continent, if we come together and we get them to work with us and get them to abide by human rights principles, and I think it's going to work. So we have these three resolutions going side by side. 620, 630, and 631. As I said earlier, 620 with African Alliance on Access to Data, 630 on Media Monitoring Africa and UNESCO, and 631 SOS Support Public Broadcasting Coalition, with others who have expressed a wish to join it. So I think it's a great time for all of us to come together and make sure that we have the resolutions and the guidelines that work. Once we've developed the guidelines, we'll see whether we go for resolutions for model law, but it's too early at this stage to state what we can do. But please, please, please do come together and help us with these resolutions in the form of drafting guidelines. I hope I have all your support. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your time. And I've posted in the chat again where people can make input on the resolutions. And ultimately, these resolutions will lead to guidelines that the rapporteur is very interested in the kind of inputs that people make. Of course, it's her prerogative to decide what the guidelines should look like, and then she will present to the ACHPR, and they will then, in turn, it's their prerogative to decide what should be in these guidelines. But of course, we know the best guidelines can be dead letters. They can just be on the shelf. So it's a matter of trying to contribute to good guidelines, and then to making sure that those guidelines actually are impactful. Thank you, dear participants. I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but you can see how rich this is. You've got in the chat the link, you can email link you can chase. I'll ask Chris to put one last time, the link for the course. And we do thank you very much for this. And thank you to the speakers. We covered very complex ground, but I think we did justice to it all. And the discussion will continue. This is the first webinar of this year by the course. You see the detail in the slides. We will have another one probably in a couple of weeks' time. And in the second half of the year, we will have an additional course. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of day. And let's keep the momentum.